Hey, welcome guys to a special edition of the Evolve Move Play podcast. I'm here with Kyle and Aaron, my two main coaches along with me at our retreats. We're not starting up the podcast just yet, but it will be back for regular episodes soon. But we wanted to get one recorded while we were all together and at the end of our retreat season. So we just finished the autumn retreat yesterday. That was our third retreat together this year and our eighth retreat in a row that we've co-taught. So we're going to talk about it. We'll talk about some stuff that have to do with what are we doing?
Letting out a big exhale after facilitating transformative experience for like 60 people, maybe?
60 people.
Close to 60 people?
Over 60. It was like 63 or 4, I think.
Yeah, we were just reminiscing on some of the stories of the past retreats with our students and the many, many characters who have showed up to co-create this experience kind of alongside us. And
mainly reminiscing on the way they roasted all of us. Yeah, that was fun. At the end. Yeah.
So people see Evolve Move Play, and they primarily see videos of me doing parkour in nature. And maybe to a lesser degree, they see rough and tumble play stuff and, a lot of philosophizing. But there's a lot of elements of the retreat that are difficult to capture on camera and show to somebody who hasn't been there. So I think it'd be interesting to just kind of explore what is happening there that's beyond just the specifically movement elements that we're able to highlight and, what that's affecting, why it matters.
yeah, it's interesting because the power in what we do in some sense doesn't happen in the movement sections, but it's because of the movement that the connections solidify in some sense. A lot of the powerful things are actually the spaces in between the movements where those connections kind of myceliate and come together in a way that actually creates a deep community.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I started teaching these things in 2013, I would seek feedback from the students and say, at the end of it, we'd kind of all sit together and then say, what did you like about it? And what did you not like about it? And I kind of always expected people in the beginning to say, man, I got my Kong ball, and it was awesome. Or I did that jump that was super scary. Or it's particularly cool doing parkour in nature, and I never experienced that before. Or I never mixed martial arts with parkour. And for the most part, those things are not the primary things that people highlight from their experience. The number one thing people always highlight is the connection that they made to other people at the retreat. You've just talked to a bunch of our students to get some feedback on what we're doing. What did you get reflected back to you about what was meaningful to them? Why were they coming back?
Yeah, I think the general theme is the idea that we don't get to play in our daily lives outside of recreational sports or card games or these very weird public domains of sports and what's acceptable to do as an adult. And a lot of people just have given the feedback that this is what they would prefer to be doing with their friends, is actually touching in playful ways, wrestling, and running through the woods, being in the forest together, interacting with the environment. And they don't get that in their life, and they're actually sometimes ostracized, or people are what the hell are you doing, running around in the woods picking up logs. And they've expressed that the community component, the coming together with other people in a safe, supported space to connect and to grow into the potential. And the way that I see that is people actually are really capable when given opportunity. And a lot of times in our modern world, people aren't given the encouragement or the opportunity to jump off a cliff, wrestle with a friend, engage in an intentional conversation. And I think that that's really what we provide is a lot of opportunity for people to tap into experiences and potential that is already there. But our world is kind of like pushing, holding you down, like, oh, potential, let's quell it.
Yeah, that aspect of overcoming limitations. It's such an interesting thing to watch it play out. Like, people come in, they're awkward in their body, they're uncomfortable with getting into movement, they don't necessarily have a lot of movement vocabulary. And I feel like every day on the first day, there's a sense of like, oh man, is this going to be as good? Because we remember what it was like at the end of the previous event. And it's never as good on the first day because people haven't really bonded together, all the little layers haven't been built up, but you're always like curious. But then on the second to last day, we end with this like dance jam in the thing. It's always remarkable to me how crazy and free form things get. People throwing, spinning kicks and handstands and rolling and falling on the ground together, and everyone stays safe.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it I think has to do with how much time we can actually spend warming ourselves up. Not just like warming our joints up, but warming up our sensitivity, warming up attunement to one another, warming up the capacity to perceive space, right? So spending many days doing that is a luxury that a lot of people don't give themselves, or we just don't have space for it in our lives. So the retreat, I think, the non-glamorous side of the retreat provides people space and time to slow down enough to notice things. And when they can notice things, they can feel all the choices they have. And when they can feel all the choices they have, they can start stretching into those things. And and it takes time for that to kind of cohere as a group. But yeah, I'm always happy by the end when there's like this kind of spontaneous, magical kind of party that emerges,
Yeah.
People are flying, floating, climbing trees, cartwheeling. Yeah.
I think, like you said, the thing that surprises me the most is how safe people are. Like, you had people on your back, people are like literally getting like thrown, they have the eyes closed exercise, people are, blindfolded, moving through the space, doing things they probably have never done before. I'm doing things I've never done before. When I'm interacting with the students or you, I'm like in a state of surprise of what emerges, and everybody leaving with like not only not injured, but often like feeling better. And I'm always like, what is that? And you said time, but my question is like, can you get there sooner? And what do you think you would need, or what is that?
Can I get there sooner?
Yeah. Could you get,
I
yeah.
add an amendment to your question.
Yeah.
Because I think part of it is this idea of attunement. And that's something that you talk a lot about in the way that you frame your work, and the way that you engage people in body-to-body practices, what you call rough housing. It's this like space where dance and martial arts meet. And you really kind of like dialed into this idea of attunement as central to what you're trying to achieve there. Can you talk a little bit more about what attunement is to you? What you're like, how it's fostered through these things and what it can deliver.
Sure. Attunement level 1. The first, like, attunement to self, right? Tuning the instrument is one way I think about attunement. Does this joint harmonize with this joint?
Yeah.
Right? So the attunement to self, tuning the instrument, attunement to the environment. And that's really attuning to like perceptual things, like am I actually using my eyes? Like my eyes can perceive space in so many different ways. Here we are in this forest. There's amazing little gaps between all these tree trunks. Can I see the gap? Can I see the depth, right? Can I use my eyes? Can I use my ears? So like a sensual, sensory attunement. And then with other people, there's this whole other kind of many, many layers of it too. So the space around Kyle, touching Kyle, right? Levels of touch. I got skin, I got muscle, I got bone, I got blood. There's like all these ways to kind of attune to his body and his responses to me, right? Like, so if I'm getting in closer to Kyle and Kyle's kind of backing away and I see his, like the corners of his eyes tighten, there's some attunement for me, like, oh, I don't think he wants to be close to me right now. I don't even have to ask the question, are you okay with me being close? Can I give you a hug? Like, I already know. That's a no. So that's kind of a level of attunement as well.
It's interesting to hear you frame it that way, because you're talking about some of these fundamental relationships that we described as like where meaning comes from. Meaning arises from the relationship internal to self. Meaning arises from the relationship of the self to the physical world. Meaning arises from the self in relationship to others. But by switching from the word relationship to the word attunement, you're bringing in this metaphor of music, right? It resonates. I actually first heard the idea that a warm-up should be thought of as tuning your instrument from Tom Lexar, a mutual friend. And it really struck with me. It's like you're not just trying to build, heat in the muscles.
Sure.
You're actually trying to get them all talking to each other effectively. Harmonizing.
Good rhythm, yeah.
And like, if you imagine like a band, right? Like you're playing with somebody, you're playing music. Like, it's very easy to be off, right? Someone who's like jumping a little bit too ahead in the rhythm every time. It's like, just like give it space, right?
Yeah.
Right. Or, it's trying to play this way and it doesn't meld with everyone. But then there's this moment where like the nervous system sort of come into resonance, and then something really cool can happen. That's why so many people enjoy jamming and playing music.
Right.
And the same thing is really happening on this level. And I think what you're pointing about, like perception, are you attuned to the environment, is a really interesting analogy, way to think about it, because we tend to think that we are like safe or unsafe in movement because like we either have the skill or we don't have the skill.
Yeah.
Right? But like for me, it's a sense of like being attuned to the right information from the environment and from myself. So like if my mind is going in other places, like even though I have the skill, I'm not ready to do the skill at that moment. But if I can find this place where the things that help me control my movement are really salient to me, and the rest of my brain can kind of take a break, then I feel like I can do sometimes stuff that feels superhuman.
I think that's a really good point, that it's not whether or not I have the skill that allows me to do it. It's actually whether or not I feel like safe enough to take the leap into it. Like I feel that like sometimes I do have the skill, but because of my emotional landscape, the environment that I'm in, something that just happened a moment before, like I got a text message, all of a sudden like I can't access the skill. And I think about that with our participants, who a lot of them don't have the skill, but yet are, because of the environment that's created, they're so capable in what I saw people do for like the very first time that they did it, that it, the moves they did probably don't even have names or exist for what was happening in this forest.
Skill kind of becomes like a natural outcome of an environment that's creative. It's like if you just spend time in this environment, skill will develop. That's a really interesting thing.
I think, like, imagining that challenge that you're looking at and you're either ready for it or not. It almost feels like striking two strings of a guitar, and they're actually harmonizing in resonance, or they're not, and you're like, oh, it's off tune. But it's out of this instrument's out of tune. And you feel that all the time, right? In your practice, you're either attuned and the task is well matched to where you're at. And then it's the same thing with other people. As you're engaged in practice, it's like, you and I usually like fall into resonance in the way that we practice really fast. Like we can just fall into this
we push each other a little bit, and all of a sudden,
productive, crazy state of movement. Like we'll start with one game and we'll end up adding layers, and the other person's just immediately able to pick it up.
It's actually exactly like tuning an instrument.
Yeah.
Like ding, 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 like no, and then you're like turning, and I see that when you guys are pushing, you're like pushing, and then it's like, no, I need to tighten to hit that C note.
Yeah. But then this time, because we had some stuff that was going on, between us coming into it, I felt like it took a little while. Like it was like I was looking for that. I was like, I just wanted to have that fun play with you. But it was like, it was fine, but it wasn't really bang on. And then there was a point where it was like, we were bang on. Hit on. And it was like, and I think that's such an interesting thing about what all the non-movement stuff does for the movement within the context of what we do. Because I've noticed this for years, that it feels like I'll look at an athlete when they show up on day one, and I'll be like, they're just not going to be able to do some of these things, right? Like, and they'll be like, there's no way I could do that. But like 3 days in, all of a sudden, you'll see them sink into some aspect of themselves that they've never accessed before. And they do this jump that you're like, well, where did that come from?
It's an altered state, right? They actually step into an altered state, which is not a psychological thing. It's a physical.
Yeah. It's literally an
ready and able.
Yeah.
At this moment.
Yeah.
Now, tomorrow I might not be able to do it, but today I can.
And so that I'll pose it kind of as a question, but I've noticed that especially the rough housing practice really allow people to get into connection in the non-movement thing, but I don't always see the non-movement things feed into the rough housing like movement things. I'm curious like what your perspective is on that. And
see, I think
because they do synergize, but it's almost like I see this feed that and then this feed that, but it's hard to see it from the reverse cycle.
So you see that the rough housing feeds the ability to dialogue, which does feed back to the rough housing. But you see that like the physical is more the root.
Yeah, and I feel like it's like a one-way. Like if you were to reverse the cycle,
go dialogue first, then rough housing, it doesn't work as well. Yeah, it's interesting. Like one of the big things that I think about in building a pedagogy of movement or in general cultivation is where are the asymmetrical relationships? Like if I do X, I get better at Y, but if I do Y, I don't get better at X.
Yeah.
Like where X is, that's the practices that we want. We want the practices that have the most asymmetrical relationships. And I think that like rough housing is one of those things, and it does. And I also like, this is part of the model of the 5 relationships. We used to talk about 4 pillars of practice.
Yeah.
Movement, nature connection, community, and mindfulness, right? And we switched talking about connection to self, connection to the world that we move through, connection to the world of things we can manipulate. So like we could think of it as self, landscape, objects, other living agents, and the transcendent. And what I think is the really kind of radical claim in what we're doing is that the best place to start the relationship to self is not meditation. It's a somatic, structural, physical practice.
Yeah. And play. I mean, one of the things about play, when I contrast play to like mindfulness practices, is play has mindfulness. You play, when you're in a state of play, you're deeply, deeply, deeply attuned, paying attention, you're mindful, all the things that are distracting just aren't there, or the volume is turned way, way down on them. But unlike mindfulness seems like I'm compelling myself to pay attention. Like, whereas play kind of draws my attention. It's like I just have to put myself in a state, and I'm attracted to it, right?
Yeah.
Versus kind of forcing myself to
Like
do
you
it.
can't. It's almost. It's like you can't not pay attention.
I can't not pay attention.
Like
exactly.
I'm so interested in the game, and you see this with people's awareness. Like in the apple orchard, people are running into apple trees and branches because they're so in the game that they kind of like lose
Right.
a lot of the other things. But in like meditation, what I'm hearing is like you're trying to like hold that state in
Right.
some ways, and everything else is coming in.
Yeah.
And so so how do you play with yourself? I think because what you're saying is like, how do I, like the self is first.
Well, what I was saying is that, I think of rough and tumble play as the foundation of dialogical practice.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Sure.
So we wrestle and then we philosophize. And I think that wrestling before philosophizing works much better than philosophizing before wrestling. The same way that we don't always do it. Sometimes we fall away from our primary model, but a lot of times we'll put a play open, like a structured game, a constraint-led game, at the beginning of something before we talk about any technical components. And it's surprising. You're like, man, I'm not sure if this is the safest way to do this, and then it is, and it's weird. Like you're surprised by it. Like we had a 63-year-old woman, and we had super athletic young men playing tag in the woods together before we taught them parkour techniques.
Mm-hmm.
But weirdly, it's safer the tag. Once the awareness is set up right and the game is constrained properly, because it allows the athletes to self-organize and choose strategies that work for them.
Right.
And then they tap into the ability, the part of their mind that makes them better at motor control, so that when we introduce the technical components, they pick them up better.
Yeah.
Whereas when we teach technique first, people get stuck in their head. They can't really get their hooks into it in the same way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe they're fatigued by the time they get to the game. It's so often the game first model works better.
Yeah. And I wonder if if you did a technique first and then the game, they might be so focused on implementing the technique in the game that it actually diminishes their performance in some way.
Yeah.
Because it's because when we play a game, and then we go to a technique, I'll be like, hey, you guys have everybody did a step vault, right?
Yep.
I watched you guys all do it, and now we're just going to see if we can do it a little bit better, more efficient.
Study it a little bit more, refine it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Be a little more aware of what you were doing unconsciously.
Yeah.
We all have unconscious competence. Let's develop some conscious competence now.
Yeah, it's funny. The first analogy that popped in my head is jiu-jitsu classes, right? It's always learn a technique, warm up, learn a technique, learn a technique, roll without any constraints that lead to the technique. It's what if you rolled first?
Right. With some constraints.
With constraints that lead to the techniques that we're then going to explore towards the end of class.
Yeah, you're rolling, but the only thing you could actually do is an arm bar.
Yeah.
Just that.
And I think it gets you into those, for me, it gets me to a motivational state where I actually want to learn technique. Because I see how far I can actually get on my own, and then I see where my own lack of skill is.
Yeah.
Actually, I can pass guard, I can hold my opponent down, I can escape, I can do all those things. So I'm not actually interested in learning those things because I'm kind of bored at that moment. I'm I don't know how to finish my opponent. Mm-hmm. Now I'm interested in learning the technique so that I can actually win the game.
Yeah. Yeah. To go back a step, I wanted to say that about the idea of how to so the fundamental idea is we think that the actual physical games are really the basis of the pedagogy for really all education. And and the reason that I think this is true is because it integrates all of the aspects of the self. Right? When I'm mindfully moving and paying attention to the emotions that arise through the movement, I have the cognitive, physical, and emotional attunement that's happening. Whereas if I sit quietly, I'm actually in some sense, trying to shut the signals of my body down.
Oh, right. I mean, that was my big thing, like with yoga, right? I got deeply, deeply into yoga, and I realized the underlying philosophy of yoga is one of ascension. It's one of leaving the world, shutting down the world, inverting my senses for some kind of supposed pure essence that is not contaminated by incarnate form. And after but okay, maybe that's true, but I like incarnate form, and I'm incarnate, so why not incarnate more and descend, be here more?
That's actually, I like that.
Yeah.
That's well, I think that actually aligns with a lot of the conversation we were having at the retreat around the philosophy of the machine and the idea that we're trying to escape our embodied reality.
Yeah.
And that's something that's deep within the yogic tradition, the Buddhist tradition, Gnostic aspects of Christianity. All of them tell us that the world that we actually experience is fundamentally corrupted, and that our correct relationship to it is to try to renounce it. You and I were at a Zen monastery for the Respond Project, right? Reiki, and every morning they sung, "A truly enlightened soul, a truly awakened soul shall not be born again into this world."
That was like the ultimate.
Right?
Yeah.
And for me, we read passages from The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram, who talks about you are your body, right? The phenomenology of your sensual experience is the foundation from which your spiritual practice, your experience of the oneness state, your science, all of it arises from this fundamental phenomenology of having an experience of the world, which can only happen via a body. And so that's the kind of radical idea is, the axial age religions gave us the two worlds mythology, where the good stuff's in the upper world.
Yeah, supernatural.
Yep.
And the supernatural. And then when we kind of entered the modernist perspective, we lost the supernatural and lost all the good stuff and meaning at the same time, right? But I think that actually when we reconceptualize the body through phenomenology, we realize that all that stuff that we put in the supernatural was all inside of the natural to begin with.
I've never really thought about it that way, and I'm trying to understand it. Is embodiment the opposite of enlightenment, or is there a better, if this idea is to ascend and escape and be pure, like you said, I actually really like the idea of being on the ground, right, and rolling in the dirt, and the freedom and possibility that's afforded to me on this planet, in this body, with other people and all of the creatures. The more I get into that experience, the more fun, meaning, and aliveness I have. And when I meditate, maybe I just haven't gotten there yet, but there's not this joy that comes from trying to dose. And not that I'm trying to go somewhere. It's just I actually prefer it to go deeper into this world more so. And I'm wondering, is there a term for that? Is there a religious orientation towards that kind of mindset? Because that's actually really interesting to me right now. We were talking about this idea of ascension versus descension. Right. I don't know. I'm still trying to find a word. Embodiment is the closest, but it's almost
incarnation versus
that's an interesting one right there, because you're saying which religions are kind of oriented towards that.
Yeah.
And Harry, you pointed out Taoism. But I think there's something interesting about Christianity in that too. A lot of Christianity is very much oriented towards heaven. Certainly, most of the history of the Catholic Church was deny everything about the body so that you can go to heaven.
Yeah.
But one of the things that Christ said that really resonates with me is the kingdom of heaven is laid out before you, if you're advised to see it. That's not the exact quote, so
paraphrasing.
Paraphrasing
the Bible. It's always a good idea.
Yeah. You know what the quote is? Put it in the comments.
Yeah. So don't get at me because I don't know my Bible letter and verse, but I believe it is along those lines. And there's this really profound idea that God incarnated, isn't it, in this world to redeem our experience, and that the end state of that is not that we disappear from the world, but that the world itself becomes the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
And you can you view that literally, but I like to think of it as symbolic, which is that if we take on a mode of being where we love the world so well, we'd be willing to suffer crucifixion to redeem the world, then we can participate in moving things towards the kingdom of heaven. And that is an incarnate and physical practice.
Yeah, versus this like escape. Like I need to enlighten, I need to go to Mars. It's okay if I'm just good enough. I'll get to actually go to the kingdom of heaven, which is this better place beyond. And it's like, I wonder how that mindset is not allowing us to do exactly that. Like when we fully accept responsibility, we fully participate in the relationships of the world, the kind of tending and the possibility. It's like, it's like the garden. And you're like, you know what? Like, well, I'm not going to live here. I'm not going to, put the time in to put a garden in. But when you're like, you know what? I'm going to put in a garden. I'm going to put in the work. Like, then that's the only way you can get the fruit. Yeah. Versus like, well, maybe one day I'll have a house and in that place I'll have a garden, and maybe you get there, maybe you don't. But I'm like, yeah, how do we?
There's this beautiful book by Eugene Peterson, not Jordan Peterson. Eugene Peterson is a pastor, and I think it's called Running with the Horses, and he talks about Jeremiah in this book, and how Jeremiah is a prophet, and he's a prophet at a time when the Israelites are kind of exiled, and they're just kind of waiting for God to redeem them and bring them back. And Jeremiah is basically like, no, marry, plant gardens, like make this your home right where you are. Don't wait for a better time. And I think that's just like this.
Yeah,
make this your home.
That's a good quote. Don't wait for a better time.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, I'm gonna get fit. I'm gonna start dieting. I'm gonna start I'm gonna start doing all of those things.
Yeah, when I'm in a better community, when I have better friends, when I have a better job. Yeah, when I'm living in a nicer place.
And I see that in some of the people who like heard a podcast and take the initiative and kind of hear that message to come to these retreats. Like, actually, I want that. That is accessible. I can do that now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in some sense, like not knowing what they're stepping into in hope, but somehow getting that out of it. And I'm not really sure what this thing is.
Nobody's sure when they show up. It's always funny, right? And you hear it every time. Like, people are like, see, I'm really cool. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. I signed up because I was excited. Then I felt a lot of apprehension when I showed up. And then at the end of it, they're like, that was awesome. That was the best thing I ever
experienced. That's so interesting because, like, in my work, just like outside of EMP, like no one knows what they're going to show up to in one of my classes. And I put almost no effort into trying to explain it. It seems like you put so much effort into trying to explain exactly what's going on, and still nobody knows what they're going to do.
That's true.
Right?
Well,
so
you
it's
never
like,
know.
I think like the mystery is really something like, just like stepping into a mystery is actually compelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I just take joy in articulation. Right?
Sure.
I think that's my gift in a lot of ways, and so I got to share that with the world. That I will leave some pathways into the mystery, I guess.
Right. But still, even explaining, like, hey, we're going to do parkour, we're going to be in nature, we're going to roughhouse.
Yeah.
That's just an explanation. That's like
it's a map.
reading the menu versus tasting the food, right? Yeah. Tasting the food is a completely different experience.
Yeah, the map is not the territory.
Yeah.
Literally, if you go to one of the world's best restaurants, you might be like, oh my God, I spent a lot of money. This looks good on paper, but I don't know how it's going to be executed.
Right.
Also kind of challenging and weird. I don't know why they're putting these things together.
Yeah. Why do they put tobacco on the ice cream?
think it could make sense in theory. Hopefully you have a great experience.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to go back to is, so fundamentally we think that the embodiment is the beginning of self-cultivation. And intentionally being more incarnate, intentionally being more oriented towards enjoyment, bringing joy in, right, through the way that we interact with the world, through play, through better relationships, better communication, better storytelling, right? All of that stuff is so important. And that's where I do think that it inherently does feed back to the merit practices. Because I came to starting to teach these events from teaching group classes in parkour, right? And so I was teaching a little bit of the rough and tumble stuff, like martial arts stuff, through the parkour gym and strength training. And what I noticed after a couple of years was that I would see bigger progressions in skill in the retreat format that a comparable amount of time in a group class by a large margin.
Yeah.
And I believe that a lot of it had to do actually with just the sense of being fully socially supported.
Yeah.
That people's fear of other people's judgment is so ubiquitous and so inhibiting that it's actually like we're all driving with the parking brake on all the time.
Yeah, in a retreat setting, we actually have the chance to take that off. And it takes a day or two. And it takes a few games and a few iterations of conversations with people to be like, oh, I can trust you. You're actually a nice person. I wasn't sure about you, but you're okay.
Yeah. And without any intentional practice, right, you get some of that by just sitting around a campfire together, just letting people chat in downtimes, just doing the dishes together, right? And then one of the huge things that we found is music.
Yeah.
If you in 2016, we had three students, two came from a capoeira background, and one just was a musician. And they just spent a whole night playing music while I was sick with Lyme disease. And it was like magic when they got back.
Yeah.
And like back to that idea of attunement, hearing your voice resonate with a group of other people's voices, literally tunes you into their nervous systems in the most profound way. And it's funny, like I have like a whole set of triggers, I guess, around having grown up as a hippie kid.
Sure.
Like hippie songs, the earth is our mother, we must take care of her, right? And I'm like, if I hear that song, I'm going to choke somebody. And then we sing songs like that are kind of hippie songs,
Pretty hippie songs.
They're pretty hippie songs. They're simple. They're easy to sing because, that's what's going to work in a large group.
Right.
They're about nature and connection and, gratitude and all the stuff that hippies would be into.
Yep.
And it works. It's so profound and powerful.
Right. And just like vocal musical games too, that aren't word based, but using like musical. Hey, I'm going to contribute this sound. You contribute this sound. That's an amazing way to do things.
Voice is a profound part of our embodying.
Yeah, I was actually surprised at how connective
those musical games, right?
Musical game. I was like, this is gonna go really bad,
and it was amazing afterwards.
Really awkward, and then when you move through that awkwardness, all of a sudden and you felt the safety, like you said, the parking brake is off. Like, people aren't laughing at me. They're actually encouraging me to do this. And now I have enough time to do it a little bit better and get feedback. And then it actually became a fun, connective, literal, like, attunement, like, vocally.
Right. And at Return to Source, we did it in little groups of 6.
Yeah.
And I remember several of the groups being like, we formed a band. Like, we're taking this on the road. So it's like, very, very fun stuff.
Yeah, so we've found real magic with just music, and then since we've started interacting with John Vervaeke's work, awareness of circling and that tradition, authentic relating. I believe we're kind of researching that independently, and dialectic into dialogos. all that has started to come in. And it's interesting because I think it really helps with skillful communication. I'm just, kind of pondering here right now, but there's almost a way in which too much approach to the skill can inhibit a little bit of the natural flow of people's conversations.
Yeah.
And so it's like, the dialogical practices are really valuable, but we want to be very careful about seeding just enough to help upgrade people's skills slightly, and then give them lots of space to just be humans together, having a chat around a campfire.
Well, I think it's like any good game, right? If the game is too prescribed, you inhibit people's freedom and their creativity. If you have just enough constraints in a game, there's a lot of play that can actually occur. The game is a structure in which play occurs, and I think we can do dialogue games, essentially. So a dialogue game is like, hey, here's the constraint. We're going to have a conversation, but the constraint is, let's not bring in the past, and let's talk about whatever. This experience that we just shared,
Especially in the short form game, I'm imagining, and I couldn't get an answer back. I was like, I'm imagining this about you. And then just, And then the next day, that actually seeded a bunch of
lot of
rich
curiosity, right?
conversations. I'm like, so that thing that I was imagining, like,
Is that
Tell me
true?
more,
Yeah.
so it was like just enough.
The right kind of constraint that potentiates something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that those things can feed back, right? I actually think that what we've seen over the years is our student base is mostly not people who have martial arts backgrounds or are even necessarily interested in pursuing martial arts.
Sure.
And a lot of them are a little intimidated by the martial arts component of what we do.
Yeah.
And we've been able to go pretty deep into martial arts with a lot of our student groups where we're, doing full on, palm striking, kickboxing, where we're doing grappling at a high level. And it always feels so much better than most of the classes that I would go to, especially classes that have novices in them.
Sure.
And I think a lot of it comes from the dance-based aspects of how we build up. Like, we don't start with, try to hit someone in the head.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Try to stroke their cheek.
Gently, try to stroke someone's cheek gently, try to tap their shoulder, try to, gently brush your foot across the top of their foot.
Right.
And,
over the years, like that sort of thing, I realized like a lot of people coming to me were actually not interested at all in pursuing martial stuff, but could benefit tremendously from that sort of training.
Yeah.
So I had to figure out a way to like, hey, this is a way to enter a flow state with another person and have a conversation. And if you want to pursue it, it could actually go martial, but what you're developing is the physical intelligence, the attunement, and the capacity to read another body.
And also there's a component of being able to be comfortable and playful within some level of adversarial.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the reality is that, like, you may never get in a fist fight, but you're gonna have a conflict with somebody.
Sure.
You're gonna feel uncomfortable emotionally. You're gonna feel like you're trying to assert something that's not being met, or someone is trying to assert something you're not ready to meet.
Right.
And something that's very simple and non-threatening, but that just plays with that dynamic a little bit, I think is so rich and nourishing for being to train. Just be like, it's not that threatening.
Yeah. Stand your ground. Someone's coming in. Like, all you got to do is just brush that away, right? Just like people talk about boundaries. I'm not good with boundaries. Like, oh, I'm pretty good with boundaries. Just wave your arms around. You got a boundary, like, it's not that hard.
Well, if you've never done that, right? Do you have boundaries? Like, we when I spoke to Jordan Peterson, I pointed out that his next book is called We Who Wrestle with God. And I said to him, during his conversation with John Novak, he'd been talking about that idea. And I said, how can you become the type of person who can wrestle with God if you haven't embodied wrestling?
Right, if you don't know what wrestling actually is.
Exactly. And, whether we're invoking God and spirituality, like even within philosophy, like the Stoics said that philosophy is wrestling in the mind.
Yeah.
right? So if we haven't had any experience of this basic physical reality of some adversarial interaction, even if it's, we don't even have to call it adversarial, but like opponent processing. It's physical opponent processing. And without opponent processing, we can't even think well.
Right.
And it's kind of like, it's like barely competitive in the sense that like, I don't actually want to hurt you.
Right.
Like winning is not the ultimate goal, but it does create a motivational state for me to try. But actually, like, I want this to go on.
Sure.
Right? I think opponent processing, that idea that I'm just kind of like trying to find the optimal like balance in between, that this is still fun and we can keep going until it's like either not fun or the energy is not there.
So you invoked like one of Aaron's like key teaching theses. I don't know.
I don't have the thesis.
Sorry. For folks who are listening to this and not watching that, I just did a bunch of weird stuff with my hands. But one of the things you really emphasize in teaching the rough and tumble component of it is the idea of an inner game and an outer game that should arise within any game, but in particular these body-to-body practices, that it becomes very apparent. And so I'm curious to just have you talk a little bit about why that's such a key idea within your work.
Yeah.
And let's start there.
Sure. So I'll illustrate it like with an example. Like, let's say I'm trying to touch Kyle's face. Kyle's trying to touch my face. I don't want him to touch my face. He doesn't want me to touch his face, right? This is the outer game. Now, the inner game could be, how relaxed am I right now? So can I stay super relaxed while I'm doing this? Or how much fun am I having right now? Like, right now, I had a lot more fun because I let Kyle squeeze my nose. I didn't like shit like that. But there's something about the outer game being the thing that holds the inner game, which is actually what's happening inside of me and what's happening inside of my partner and what's happening in the connection or in the space between us. And that to me is a very, very, very rich field of exploration. And a good outer game is just enough structure to hold a very, very broad inner game. And putting the emphasis on the inner game can be so important for, we're in a world where essentially most people see the purpose of play is to win. The purpose of play is to stop playing and be like, I have won. This interaction has a winner and a loser. I'm the winner, you're the loser. I don't want to be the loser. There's so much anxiety attached to that. And by kind of flipping the frame to inner game, it's like, it's not about this. It's about continuing to play and seeing how much fun we're having. Oh, you got a point. Great. I got a point. Great. Like, it does, like it's not like the outcome doesn't matter. The outcome does matter because it holds the interaction. So I'm still trying to win. You're still trying not to lose, but we've gone bigger than that.
So I think that's there's a couple of things in there that I want to dive into. I think it's such a powerful concept and way of framing things, just from a purely like martial artist perspective, right? If I focus always on just beating my opponent in this game, that doesn't actually necessarily optimize me for being the type of person who can then go win tournaments.
Sure.
Or win in the self-defense situation, win at some other higher order expression of.
You're not exposing yourself to novelty, actually. You're just doing something and refining the thing that you do, doing it well.
Yeah, so when I started, I took 9 years off of jiu-jitsu, and I went back to jiu-jitsu. And in that time, I'd cultivated, a lot of athletic ability. And I discovered that I still had a lot of instincts for positioning and for understanding of the kind of basic mechanics and movement through, but I had like a very unrefined game as far as like finishing.
Sure.
Right? And I was much more comfortable on top than on the bottom. And because I'm, 6'2" and 220 pounds, like most jiu-jitsu people will just flop on their back when I approach them. So I could always take the top position. And so I ended up for weeks, like running the same game. I would use a knee slice to pass guard. I would threaten a collar choke, which I had never successfully done.
Right.
And I would get them to expose an arm or roll to their back and expose a rear naked choke. And so I won every interaction by getting an arm bar or a rear naked choke. And I could do this to all the white belts, all the blue belts, most of the purple belts, and some of the brown belts who were sufficiently smaller than me. At least the first round through. Now, once people kind of recognized my game, I started to lose some of those interactions. And I was like, I literally started just pulling people into my guard so that I could learn to
work from your back.
Because someone's going to sweep you eventually.
Yeah.
Right. And I had to let go of like, how many times am I going to tap this guy out in this interaction? Because it's like, because ultimately I wasn't getting better. I was stuck in a channel within that, in a loop. Yeah. And so that's a very simple example of this, but I think that dynamic is actually much deeper. And I want to ask you a couple questions about that. But first, I'm curious about the role of the inner game of tennis and Timothy Galloway in conceptualization on this idea of the inner game.
Yeah, so I had heard of the book, but I had never read it when I was conceiving the inner game. It's like, it was something that someone told me I should read like years ago. So it wasn't actually part of my my thinking. It was much more finite and infinite games.
Okay.
So I was just pondering finite and infinite games and kind of thinking about what it means to be an infinite player. And then one day when I was teaching, the words just came up. It was like,
for the audience who might not know.
Yeah,
Finite and infinite games.
Finite and Infinite Games, James Carse, short little pithy book. The essential premise is there are at least two kinds of games we can play. One could be considered finite, the other infinite. A finite game is played to end the game, have a winner. An infinite game is played to keep on playing. That's
Like an example is you volley back and forth in volleyball or tennis in order to get the other person to not be able to repeat the volley.
Right.
So you win that point. Whereas in hacky sack, you're trying to get everybody to
hit it. Keep
right?
the ball going.
That's one
trying
example.
to get it going as much
But
as
conversations are a good example. A conversation like this one versus a debate, right? A debate I'm trying to end. I made my argument and it prevailed versus like, hey, can we just keep building this conversation and like learning?
Yeah. I used to really love to debate, and like someone was asking me,
I'm
like,
not surprised.
would you want to be like in a debate with Christopher Ryan, right? And I was like, nope, not at all. Like, I'm interested in generative conversations.
Sure.
Right. Winning at debate. Never. It's just like a false win.
Yeah. What does it win?
Right. Like you can stump the other guy, but people mostly don't get convinced by debate.
No.
So it's not like a fight or like you win.
Right. Like a dance is a nice example of a finite infinite game, right? Or an infinite game.
Yeah.
Like you wanna have a dance where at the end of the song, you want to keep dancing.
Yeah, I'm much more interested in conversations that feel like great dancing than like jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
As much as I love jiu-jitsu, and I do.
Right.
I just don't think that it's a great approach to conversation.
Exactly.
So, I think very closely related, but slightly orthogonal, is this idea of the local game and the meta game. It's an idea that Jordan Peterson talks about, but I think it's really important. But you can think of one jiu-jitsu bout is a local game. Getting good at jiu-jitsu is a more global game.
Yeah.
Right? Self-defense would be a bigger meta game. Why do you want to be able to defend yourself to be a strong person? That's a bigger game Why do you want to be a strong person? Because you want to become a good human being. That's like the overarching meta here. And like ultimately what I think of is that all of the physical practices that we do and all of the dialogical practices, they're examples of local games that actually primarily exist such that we can attune ourselves better to the metagame.
Yeah, I think
Bigger
that
and bigger and bigger.
the better analogy, I think, is basically the ecology, is that each of those games is feeding the forest.
Yeah.
Essentially, to like, oh, I actually need a little bit, we need some more trees, we need a little bit more mycelium, we need some more topsoil, we need, in looking at our practices as each of those and the way that they feed the forest that we're like trying to grow.
Yeah. We want an ecology of practices that optimally, I want to say prepares us for the metagame. That was the first word, but that doesn't sound right. It's more like that optimally engages us in an experience of the metagame.
Sure.
Right? Because,
Well, that's interesting, right?
yeah.
Because like, I've been thinking about systems thinking
Yeah.
for a little bit. I've never seen a system, right? System is actually something really, really big. By nature, I can't quite conceptualize it. It's like I can think about the component parts, but a system is huge. When I'm in a system, what I really am in is in relationship with pieces of the system. So we want to have an ecology of practices that allow us to be in better relationship with all the aspects or all the agents, all the entities within the ecology, which includes you, many parts of you, includes you, includes you, it includes each tree and the forest, right? So there's something about really like being in relationship with the sensate sensory world that to me feels like a really doable way to affect systematic change without having to conceive of huge systems.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of like hearing, like in a car, or maybe in this example, it's like, the engine doesn't touch the brakes. They're all important in the car running. Like the engine doesn't actually have a relationship with the brakes. They're not connected in any way, but you need them both for the entire system to actually operate. And so I guess I'm kind of hearing that in the relationship example is like, in the system, I need to tend to its individual parts in order for it all to work as a whole, even though they're not necessarily working in conjunction. Something like that. I'm not quite.
Yeah. Well, there's something in that metaphor that's interesting. It's a mechanical metaphor, right? So if I think of a car, I can understand, or a mechanic could understand how a car works. Like there's no mystery there, right? Whereas life, there's a huge mystery. Like I just don't know. And if I keep trying to know and know and know, it might pull me out of relationship with actually being in life. It's. I think that's kind of more what I'm saying.
Okay,
like,
yeah.
There's this.
Well, the interesting thing about the difference between a car and like a forest is the car has very clear boundaries. Right? The brakes don't interact with the engine directly. But it's very hard to point out something in a forest never ever interacts with anything else in the forest.
Yeah.
But all the boundaries are permeable and dynamic.
Yeah, true.
But I think that like the idea of attunement comes in here to being able to see the relationships between these things at the appropriate level of salience, right? So the analogy that strikes me, and I'm not a musician, so maybe I'll flub this, but the analogy that strikes me is being in a symphony, right? If you're trying to attend to all of the instruments when you're playing a specific instrument and understand exactly what's going on, then it's going to be much harder to recognize the signals of what's relevant to your role. Like, think about trying to sing a song that has like multiple parts in the chorus that has different lines.
So hard.
Right? It's hard, yeah, because you're paying attention to two things instead of seeing how that attunes you to the information that's relevant to you. And that, like, when we are interacting with systems, like, the right relationship with them has to do with this distribution of attention.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, and then this is kind of bringing us back to the whole local game versus the meta game, right? Like, we have to play our local game and have some sense of where the meta game is going, but not get lost in meta. To the point that, like, oh shit, like, here I am just learning how to do a push-up and I want to be a superhero, like.
But then even in the, well, I guess the inner game, outer game is like, if I'm playing the inner game within the outer game, so if I'm in the jiu-jitsu match, I might intentionally, my inner game is to actually try out a strategy. Even though it's not the best strategy, I'm probably going to lose a whole bunch of times, but in that inner game, I actually win because it makes me better at the bigger game.
Yeah, like I could try out, I'm going to put myself in a position of disadvantage and just play from there. I'm going to play with 50% of my strength, or I'm not going to use leg locks, or I'm only going to count points if I move super slowly and kind of slip in there without you noticing.
Yeah, I'm going to deliberately lose so that I can win more than if I had won.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a moment, we're talking about this, the local game, the attention to the local game versus the meta game, and how we can become lost in the meta level very easily. Right?
And I think especially now as we're attracting more Vervaeke people, there's a whole crowd of like meta lost folks.
Well, like we say, we can't see the forest for the trees, but you can also not see the trees for the forest. Right?
Exactly.
I feel like that's more the case. Like, people see the forest, but they don't see the cedar tree.
That's right.
Most people who are Westerners, they are, they are looking, they just see a wall of green. Right? Now, interestingly, though, if you're a logger, you could very easily see the trees and not the forest.
Sure.
Because
there's a price tag on each tree.
You have a hyper salient information about the trees that can discount the value of the trees to the native environment, the value of the trees to holding water in the soil that prevents the flooding of the farms that you rely on for food.
Right.
That's the example of missing the forest for the trees, but we go both ways. And so we can think of this kind of like top-down, bottom-up structures. And there's it reminded me of a specific moment that happened at the end of the retreat. This, after I gave my big kind of closing speech about, how we're supposed to take this into the world and what it's all about, we were sitting around the campfire, and one of the participants, Claire, she asked me, "Do you have hope?" And because we're talking about big things like, is AI going to take over and destroy us? Are we going to fall for machine civilization? Or, and it was funny because I was like, I don't, like, it was like, it didn't feel like the question made sense to me, sure way. Because it was like, whether I have hope or not, I have to act on the things that I think are true. And the most powerful places that I have to act are now and here. Right? And so are my actions now and here contributing to the good of myself, my family, and the people around me? They are.
Right.
I believe that they're contributing to the good of people further and further down the chain away from me. And I also acknowledge that the world is really weird. And so sometimes you can think that you're doing something that's really good, and it can have lots of really bad
effects down the street.
And so you should approach those things with caution. But also, if you get focused too much on like how your actions here today affect people in the Congo, you you just can't
can't
know.
act. You can't
right?
do anything. You're paralyzed.
Exactly. You're paralyzed. There's within the kind of like rationalist circles, there's this utilitarian argument for why we should be like hyper concerned for the far future. Which is like, if you imagine that human beings are going to live for another 100 million years, then almost all the humans that will ever exist in the future. And so if you consider that their well-being, their utility is just as important as ours, then we should be oriented towards the future as much as possible. So like, here's William McAskill, who wrote a book called What We Owe the Future. The problem I have with that perspective is that we can't act in any coherent way towards a future that's 10,000 years from now.
Right.
We just can't predict the consequences of our actions.
Yeah.
It's combinatorial explosion.
Right.
It's like trying to conceive how to win a game of chess every step of the way from the first thing.
Or like a week ahead of time. I'm going to play Aaron in chess next week.
Yeah.
This is how I'm going to beat him.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like,
And I don't know who's going to make the, exactly.
So you can do that, right? You
Yeah.
can do that in some sense, which is to say, I'm thinking about the game that I'm going to play with Aaron next week. I have identified certain weaknesses. So when I go into that game, these are going to be my heuristics to
Yes.
try to win the game.
Right.
So it's an attunement to attention a specific way, right?
Kind of, it's just
And
number
you're
one.
generating
Aaron doesn't
certain
play chess.
strategies,
Which is
right?
number two.
But what you can't do is actually plan out every move. And if you tried to do so, it would be a complete waste of time, which would make you far less adaptive in game of chess.
and I think to connect it back is like, we're trying the best we can to live in the best way we can now, at principle, to have better effects in at least the near-term future, knowing that, like, I was curious, like, I know some, like, indigenous perspectives are, like, 7 generations, and I wonder if they, like, capped it, because they're like, like, that's...
Can't imagine much more than that.
Anything beyond that is like we've tried 3, we did pretty good. We tried 4, like it was okay.
Yeah.
Like we got to 6, like 7 barely made it.
Right. Beyond that, they're mutants.
But that we can at least like we can look back, and we can learn from mistakes, and not that we're trying to necessarily like all out prevent future cataclysm. And because like hope is such a weird thing. Like when you said that, it was like do I have hope? I was like, well, I have motivation and orientation now towards these things. I don't necessarily I'm not riding on this thing of hope for anything. I'm moving towards the best future I could possibly imagine with the tools that I have, and having to adjust the sails kind of along the way.
Yeah, we too much attention to the meta level brings up dread or hope, whereas attention at the more local level just gives you motivation to move forward.
One step at a time.
And now there is the flip side, which is that we can get too local, right? Like one of the if you the person who wants to win the jiu-jitsu match every time that they're in the gym, no matter what, and doesn't care that they're not developing a off their back game, doesn't care they're not developing a takedown game, right? That's too local. That's not meta enough, right?
Yeah.
So we do need to do this, and I think where I see evolve, move, play within the kind of I don't know what the word is to describe this ecology of intellectual cultivation or self-cultivation that's happening, but evolve, move, play is in relationship to John Vervaeke, right? His work, and Jordan Peterson and his work, Anita Roy and her work, and there's a broader community of people who are asking similar questions, and for the most part, a lot of the communities that we interact with in that way, they're more at the level of the intellectual, more at the level of the broader system, and more at the level of the body and its connection to nature. Right? And I think that that's really important, because I feel like there are gaps that are left because so many of the people who are trying to take on these questions are taking them on at such a high level.
Exactly. And even if they actually speak about how important the body is, they speak about it in a way that actually like gives importance to the body, but it doesn't.
You can feel it.
You can
and see
feel
it.
that like they think mind and body are actually equal.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, body's very important. Mind, body equal versus like, no, fucking body is the base. This is what mind arose from. So in that sense, it's an asymmetrical relationship. It's like body is the beginning of it all.
We're having that conversation.
Your cognition comes from your body.
Yeah.
We're talking about Ian McGilchrist and like his book is so dense and so scientific and so well referenced.
Yeah.
It's about living like out of the right side of the brain.
It's like the most left-sided thing ever.
And I was like, I really love this argument as a way to do this thing, but why are you not doing the thing? Or like, how do you value something so much to write volumes on it? And it's not clear to me how you're participating in your own perspective.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not
That's a good
familiar
question.
enough with his work, so if anybody is, Ian, let me know what you're doing. I want to learn.
He seems like he enjoys just living and being in his garden and stuff.
And that was the great thing about John actually coming to our retreat, because I had that sense of like John was like speaking to these things, but the person that I see, and again, I only witnessed through the online forum, was like not quite living up to the words that were being spoken. And then for him to come out and like just be all in and participate in everything at every level, like fully all in, was just like, yeah, I don't know what you call that, just like affirmation of like, okay, this guy believes it, he talks about it, and he has the willingness.
Walks the talk.
Yeah, walking the talk, exactly.
Walk the talk, and that's what I feel like. I think a lot of people within the intellectual embodiment space, they're genuine in their belief.
Yes.
And they want to walk the talk, but they just come from a place
They
that's,
just don't have the practices.
that's so far from it that they don't recognize what it actually looks like. And I think that what we represent is people who started in super embodied things, who were searching for something that was more philosophical, right? We saw the potential for meaning in our physical practices, which so many people don't fully see.
Right.
And then went and started to absorb all the philosophical priors. And so you can see that it's like, you can talk about jiu-jitsu, but if you haven't done jiu-jitsu, you just don't know. You just don't have a feel for what it's like to pass someone's guard who's squirrely.
So I have a challenge for you.
Yeah.
Like you spent a lot of time creating an argument for why the body matters in education, why the body matters. And like all good arguments, you need philosophical pride. Like you've done that well, you can do that well, it should be a book. Can you kind of explain it in like language that's just like, like Joe Rogan podcast language? Like, why does it matter to be embodied? And it's weird, right? Because like even this question doesn't actually make any sense. It's like it's being asked from a place of like, well, if I didn't have a body, I wouldn't be able to ask the question. So there, you answered your question. But,
Yeah. I don't know that it's my gift to get all the way down to the Joe Rogan audience level of articulation, but I can try, right? Like, fundamentally, the claim is the start right there. Look at the way I'm framing it. Fundamentally, the claim is that's a debate. Like that's an intellectual.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm talking about, right? We have all these framed, like there's all these games that we play that we're not aware we're playing, and it'll be so nice to just like, hey, let's not play that game. That was a nice catch.
It's like in some sense we're coming to it, so it's like John has this philosophical framework. He's trying to be more embodied.
Sure.
We're very embodied, and we're having these really beautiful experiences, and we're trying to convey the value of that
in a propositional way, even though it's a participatory thing.
To get people to come and participate.
Right. We have to
like-
make a proposition. This is a value proposition.
But that's all we can do on a context like this. Like they cannot be playing with us right now. They can see us play,
yeah.
and that helps. And they can see us talk about what we're doing, and that helps.
Right.
But there's a certain amount of it that you just have to be there to experience. But I'm gonna switch it on you.
Yeah.
Because I think we were doing these little acting exercises before we started talking, and John was just on Theo Vaughn's podcast.
Yeah, I want to meet these.
He's like, okay, so here's a guy who has the common touch for sure. So here's my exercise for you. I want you to tell me why embodied physical practices are like the base of all education, the way Theo would say it.
He would say something like, I was so excited that I was holding my dick. You know, when you get so excited that you just hold your dick. It's something like that. I mean,
That's good. I don't think we quite got to a full up. I don't know that we got there all the way. I think it was a good Theo impression.
Keep going.
Keep going.
what's the question? The question is Theo Vaughn style. Well, I don't know Theo.
What is the argument for embodiment? As Theo Vaughn would make it.
Yeah, I think it's like it's kind of like, why am I making an argument for embodiment? There is no argument. We don't argue about things that are just. That's like, it's like saying. It's like there's no.
Like, why is it good to breathe?
Yeah, it's like, can you please convince me why I should breathe, and why breathing matters, or why should I eat or sleep? It's like just because you have to, because you are doing it.
But you have to eat and drink and sleep in a different way than you have to actually embody yourself.
Maybe not really,
But
right?
listen, because it takes enormous willpower to not drink, sleep, or eat, and you die, right? But there are a lot of people who are just living their lives, increasingly disembodied, increasingly living in their screens.
Sure.
So the reason that we have to make an argument is
For
because that happens, right? Like literally, this is crazy. I think we're moving towards a world where you have to make an argument for why you should try to have a sexual relationship in real life.
As opposed to with a robot or with porn.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, more for me. That's great. It's like,
Yeah, it's like, it's in some sense it's weird. It's weird that it's a stupid argument that has to be made, and it has to be made well, and it's actually confusing.
It's very
to me
confusing.
because it seems so obvious, which I'm imagining is your experience. Like, it's so obvious to me that I'm a body, that why would I not inhabit this thing in all that it offers me, all that it teaches me, all that it provides
right.
for me.
It's like,
That's not obvious to most people.
I know, that's what I'm
That's
like,
what's so
that's what
fascinating,
I'm
right?
trying to reflect.
Yeah.
sure,
It's
sure.
like,
And
it's,
that-
it's like
I don't get that.
Yeah.
That's not, that doesn't, you know?
It's like that psychological,
like?
stump.
to feel like you are not your body.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's a good question. What's it like to feel like I'm not my body?
Question.
And if I felt like I was not my body, what the fuck could someone say to convince me that I was? Like nothing. Unless, but there are prompts that could bring me in. It's like, what does your thumb feel like when it swipes on the phone? What does the hot little sizzly bit of bacon feel like when it comes from DoorDash? You know, like when you eat that pizza. Like there are these like tastes and sensations that are like we have to be embodied. We're embodied.
And that's what we do, right? Like people arrive at our retreat and we have them recognize that the air feels a specific way. We have them recognize that the light is playing in a specific way through the leaves. We have them recognize that there are birds singing, right? You have them recognize that there's the sound of water flowing and falling.
Yeah.
We have them recognize what different parts of their body are feeling like in that moment, including if there's an emotional layer to it.
Sure.
It's like It's like prompted relevance realization.
Yeah, we're trying to return people to realizing that their sensual experience is
Embodied.
It's embodied, and it's the heart of relevance. I'm gonna switch tacks for a second because we're talking about Ian McGilchrist, right? And it's like he's making an argument for the importance of right brain thinking while being as left brain in his argument as possible. And you can probably see that in me too, right? Like I have a capacity for articulation that's very left brain oriented.
Sure.
But Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram, I think, really illustrates how to bridge that gap. Because he makes a very
flowery, so much flowery language.
But he's
because he's poetic.
Because he's trying to evoke embodied sensations in the way that he's writing.
Yeah.
So he's not just telling you that this is what you should do while not demonstrating it. He's actually trying to write it in such a way that he's evoking the very thing that he's arguing for. And I didn't get that the first time that I read the book. And I was like, I think that's a good argument. I think that I'm aligned with it. But man, that was a weird book. And I don't even understand, like I can't even remember the argument fully as soon as you put it down. But the second time through reading, I'm like, I see what he's doing. And I know exactly why.
He's trying to touch and evoke an embodied experience as well as make an argument.
Yeah. And I think that's why, one of the reasons why the storytelling aspect of the book is also profound. That's another thing that people won't be so familiar with, right? But you tell grim,
old
stories.
Old stories, yeah.
Right? And I tell stories about, figures that help line up the arguments, right? Stuff that happened in my life, things that have happened through the parkour community. And this was the realization that actually really took me into Jordan Peterson's work in the first place. Was I had read so much strength and conditioning literature, so much scientific literature around what the optimal ways to practice were, and I'd be out teaching and I'd be like talking, and I'd just see my students' eyes glaze over, right? And it was like, that's not catching. It's not landing.
Good information. Not getting conveyed.
It's not, you can have the best information in the world, and if you can't communicate it in a way that can actually create change in your audience, it doesn't matter.
Right.
So over time, I had started to share stories from my own training, the students I'd worked with in my own life, and I could see like there is this shiny thing that happens in the eyes of the students when they're really speaking powerfully. And you can be like, that's it. I'm over the target. And so I was like, what makes stories so powerful? So when I saw Joe Rogan interview Jordan Peterson, it's like, he was this weird Kermit-voiced comedian dude. His Canadian accent drove me nuts. And I was like, I'm kind of interested. And then he starts talking about the structure of narrative and his Jungian stuff, his maps of meaning. I was like, okay. And then it was deep. And, still going back to maps and meaning to this day, getting so much out of it. So we have this component of story because, we've talked about the idea of the 4 P's of knowing, right? Propositional knowing, so that's this thing that we're talking about where I can say that, we need rotational components to optimally express power. So if we don't train in lathe and we train everything sagittally, it's not going to give us full access to that. That's a proposition. You can make a scientific argument for it, right? What does it feel like to do that? What are the drills? What is the procedure I would do to give some access to that rotational power?
Do this.
And
this.
How do you start feeling yourself, or how do you see the world when you do it? That's a perspective thing.
Doing knowing the right drills to get someone to having good rotational power, that would be procedural, right? Knowing what it feels like to have rotational power would be perspectival, right? So when we give people a semantic proposition about how they should train, we're accessing the propositional, and that's stored in semantic memory. But when we tell someone a story, we are asking them to take a perspective.
Yeah.
Enter
the story.
You enter the story.
into-
That's right. You enter many characters in the story.
Exactly, and it's stored in episodic memory.
Yeah.
So it attunes us to the perspective.
Yeah.
And that's actually, I think, a profound part of the power of the kind of work that we do. So story is another key, like, hidden component of what's happening at these events.
For sure.
And I actually sent John Vervaeke a text while we were at the retreat, because one of the things I've noticed is I have an extraordinary ability to store propositions in my mind. Like, I can remember more facts and figures
You should.
almost anybody else, right?
Both of us combined.
Yeah. And yet, like, I have very poor episodic memory, right? Like, Beth will be like, we had this fight a week ago. And I'll be like, I'm sorry, I'm just completely,
I just know it.
That's just not a thing that, like I believe you,
Yeah.
but I can't talk about
There's
it.
no recall.
Because there's zero recall of this thing that happened that was highly salient to you, right? And
Just tell her to end all arguments with a proposition and a fact.
she gives me an action item. There we go. And she has this incredibly clear memory of her childhood from the time that she's like 2 years old.
Yeah.
And I feel like I barely remember my 20s. Right? And so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, okay, so if propositional memory is stored in the semantic memory, which is a separate area of the brain from episodic memory, and episodic memory is where perspectival knowledge is generated, then if someone is hypertrophied in propositional knowledge and hypotrophied, here's some nice propositional language for you guys.
Okay. More or less. They're less developed in one way, more overdeveloped in the other way. Translation.
Overdeveloped, underdeveloped.
Be a good meme page. Like, Frank like gives a lecture, and then Aaron's like,
Too much, too little.
instead of like, you know how they have like the sign language person on the side? There's just like Aaron.
What was it, the Chappelle show or no, it was Key and Peele that had the Obama anger translator, right?
I haven't seen it, but I can imagine.
It's great. So you could be just like the Rafe translator. Yeah. Okay, back to my point. I asked him, is it possible that if you have more propositional memory and less episodic memory, it's actually harder to access empathy? That empathy is probably associated with the capacity to generate episodic memory because that allows perspective to it. And he said that, that's a plausible hypothesis that I've never heard before, which is pretty cool if I'm generating plausible cognitive science.
Via text.
Yeah, text.
Screenshot this, please.
I got an idea, John. Check this out. Do some research.
Yeah. So then the interesting idea then is that, so we take people out and we do movement and we teach them skills. And those skills are stored as procedural memory, right? We tell them, and then when we play games, I think we're really accessing participatory perspectival. In particular. Like, it all is accessed into some degree, all these things, but we're biasing towards certain of these ways of knowing. And when we tell stories,
Right.
we are building this episodic capacity in people, which is another way that we're making people better at attuning to perspectival knowledge.
And it's one of the reasons, like, you do let's feed the story of the day. Let's tell the story of the day.
Yeah, and
together.
I think that's also like these threshold moments that like ritual and ceremony and thresholds like basically put a pin in experience.
Right.
Otherwise, if it was just experience,
One continuous thing.
it's hard to know when anything happened. And I wonder like what the science behind the skits are and how it forces them to go into episodic and create a narrative and how I'm actually thinking about how do we actually craft threshold moments throughout the experience, and can we actually test that in what shows up reliably in those stories?
Yeah.
Is there a theme,
Okay.
like of the waterfall, right?
Yeah.
How many times did that show up in the story?
First of all, for the audience, they don't know that we do skits, so let's just
They don't know.
briefly
Well, they're
tell
not
them
even
that.
skits. They're not skits. One of the things that we do at the end of at the retreats is we ask people to, in groups, small groups, kind of tell or show the story of their experience. Yeah. And Kyle, you frame it super well, so maybe you want to say something about that.
Yeah, exactly that. Their objective is to tell the story of their week, and it's to do it in a creative way. It could be a poem, could be a haiku, could be musical, could be theatrical, could be all of the above, but it's some sort of performance-based activity that we get to witness them do.
We get and they get to witness.
Yeah,
Right? They get
yeah.
to, like, it's a small group, so most of the participants are actually in the audience watching. And then
So one of the reasons that started was, so we had recognized that there was incredible power to stories, but we generally had this idea that an insight is more powerful when it's self-generated than when it's given to you. So rather than
100% of the time.
just giving students information, we're trying to create a potent moment for their information to arise within them. And so that's one reason why we started this, right? Tell your story. And one of the things that's come out of it is a lot of times we get roasted by the students.
Encouraged.
yeah, we encourage.
Well, we encouraged it after it started.
Yeah.
Right? We just leaned into what was already happening. And I think that plays a couple really important things. One, like when you do scary stuff like jump off cliffs and engage with martial arts, and like in the past, especially when I take people really deep into martial arts, I talk about violence and, like killing people and all that stuff. Like that can be heavy, right? And, me and my super articulated propositional knowledge frame, it's a little heavy. So getting levity into the event is super important.
Yeah.
Right? So having that levity is huge. And also, because we do things that are so powerful in catalyzing identity and connection, it's very easy for there to be too much projection onto the key figures, which can create cult-like dynamics. And so it's really, really important, I think, actually, that we create an opportunity for the students to take us down a peg.
I was just going to say, it's like it's equalizing.
It is absolutely equalizing. So it's a super important component for me, for us to be at lampooned at some point in the organization, because it completely changes the dynamic, right? And it's like there has to be teacherly authority in order to affect what we're trying to affect. But it's very easy for that authority to become overgeneralized and projected into in a way that takes away the autonomy and agency of the students, which is ultimately the exact opposite of what we're trying to do.
I think we actually do a very good job of like, hey, we're taking care of you for this period of time, and boom.
Yeah.
Now here you go. We're no longer special.
Yeah.
And like, thank you so much for being here.
And I think the way that we play off each other is also really powerful in affecting that by
It's not
kind
just
of like
one key voice.
creating the idea, okay, here, this person's king for the moment, and that role is important in the structure of what we're doing, but king for the moment isn't the king.
Sure. Yeah.
And you can go just be a dude, at parts of the event, and that's really important. But so I was just laying out kind of the things that I thought were important about it, but I was really interested in what you were saying about this idea that we're actually, so telling the story is important because it creates insight.
Yeah.
But actually, like, we're helping them map the salient points in the map, because they're not going to carry the whole experience with them forward. Right? And an exercise that maps the things that are most salient for them before they leave will actually allow them to sort of like, what's the term when you take a high resolution image and you make a lower resolution version of it? It's not condense, it's
Smudge?
compress.
Okay.
It allows them to compress their experience in a way that creates the the highest fidelity image afterwards that they can then access and get the most salient information from it. Holy shit, that was very propositional.
But it's good.
But we're doing that in layers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We do that in many ways.
Yeah.
We do that for every game. There's a dialogue.
Yep.
So there's something there. We do that at the end of every day. As a group, we kind of feed the stories and like, these are the images I saw. I saw Marion Lee shaking on the edge of the cliff. I saw this, right?
Yeah.
And then we do that at the end through like watching others perform their experience and performing our own experience.
That's actually really, I've never thought about that's maybe, it's not why we do it, but now I'm like, well, that's why we do it. Like it's actually like,
I love that when you're like, wow, past me, you were smarter than I realized.
But that's the thing. I think like there's something about like at least the way I like to create material is by creating material and trusting that there's some deep intelligence behind it.
Yeah.
And then I'll look back at it later and be like, oh, that's what I was doing.
and being able to pull that forward and intentionally do some of those things or work towards that.
Towards it, and also being open to like the deep intelligence that's going to emerge and want to modify things.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's because it's like, that's the creative. I'm accidentally creating these things that science could come in and be like, wow, like that was really amazing, like what you did.
Yeah.
And then you're also like, there are things that do work.
Yeah.
In principles, essentially.
Sure.
I can tell a little story about how that process can happen, right? So I was teaching a very sort of strict top-down pedagogical system that really came from gymnastics, and I brought into parkour. And then I took people out into nature, and half the stuff that I wanted to teach them, they figured out before I got a chance to teach them.
Just by walking to the place.
Just walking to the place.
Jumping over logs and stuff.
And I like, my initial reaction to that was like to feel really threatened.
Yeah.
Like I felt like, what's the point? Like I've spent so much time building this material. Like I thought I was the best parkour coach out there because I had this material, right? And now it turns out that a lot of it was totally unnecessary.
Yeah.
But like I chose to lean into it, and I thought about this idea of tricking my students into learning a skill. That was the original way that I framed it in my mind. Was, how can I trick students into learning a skill without them knowing that we're trying to get this skill into? And that was just a creative moment. Later, one of my students told me, what you're doing looks like constraint sled. It looks like dynamical systems approaches to learning.
What the hell is that?
And he asked me if I was familiar with it, and I was like, no. And he pointed me to Franz Bosch, and then through various ways I found Rob Gray and stuff. Interestingly, at the time, and I think this is kind of similar to what you're talking about with the inner game. Like I took the idea and I just played with it without actually absorbing all of the propositional content. Like I got like just the headline version of what the constraint sled approach was.
And then you just started doing it.
Just played with it for a long time. For almost a year, I didn't read anything really intense about the constraint sled approach. I just was like, this idea makes sense. I don't want to absorb too much. I just want to let it play through me. And then there was a space where I wasn't teaching or whatever, and I like absorbed all of Rob Gray and Franz Bosch and started on Bernstein. And I was able to call on the experiences that I already had to make sense of that material as I was absorbing it. And then, of course, we now have a more sophisticated model that we can then bring, but we are always trying to leave room for the emergence.
And I think that's what's cool about our team too. Like, like I'm almost 100% emergent. Right? Like, you guys gotta rein me in. But some really good material comes out of that.
It's
right?
true. It does.
Like,
it does.
Brilliant stuff comes out of that.
Well, but you say that, but what you taught on the last day was super taxonomized.
Yeah, that's like
highly like progressive.
Sure.
And it was pitch perfect for the audience as a way of introducing them to, like, the goal was roughhousing games that you can take home and introduce to your friends.
Sure. Yeah. And that's like a curriculum I had developed based on a bunch of stuff that
You've
had
done
emerged.
a bunch of emergent weird stuff.
And like, that's the thing. Like when I teach workshops here, these are the 6 exercises you can take home.
Yeah.
But that was I think what you're saying is that activity was non-emergent.
It wasn't.
Yeah.
Well, it came from emergence originally, but like,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
he wasn't giving himself enough credit for his ability to taxonomize.
Right,
And
right. I
it's
can
not-
taxonomize.
It's actually a very,
94%.
it's a very important part of your skill set as a coach.
It is also text. Yeah, that's right. But what I was pointing at is like, I think one of the great things about teaching with you guys is how we have very, very different skill sets and sometimes styles, and sometimes they actually like.
Yeah, we create tension sometimes.
There's tension, but there's like a deep appreciation.
Yeah.
You know.
And
And it's like, hey, Ray,
good
you got to stop talking. It's time to stop talking. Okay, great. But like what you said was brilliant, you know? But it's going to land much better if we stop now.
yeah. Or I'll be like, I need to know how this contributes to the overarching pedagogical goal. Use
Right.
my big word.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. Like we had more tension at this particular event around some of that in the beginning.
Right.
And then we
But I think
spent
it
one
resolved
morning
so beautifully.
really, really working through the material. And it was the first time that we'd like completely sort of mapped it together, how it was going to arise. And it was so beautiful. It like came out so nice and made me think of team basketball, right? We were like passing the ball back and forth and creating openings for each other.
It's like, yeah, and like you spoke to earlier, the willingness to be in conflict is like,
Sure.
Yeah.
because like we have communication practice, we have wrestling practices, we can see like, hey, like I'm losing a lot right now. Like,
Right.
can you like ease off like on this thing so that I can like kind of find the flow again, or can we have like a sparring match essentially to rebuild that? And I think that's just like a really beautiful thing, that it can really easily like just go in one direction and kind of like not resolve itself except in the like dissolution of things, but to be like, yeah, our ability to give each other like feedback in the moment, and for us to take some of it and also not take some
Yeah,
of
be
it.
like, I hear you. And no, I'm going to keep doing this, you know, like.
Yeah. I thought that was like a big growth area for us as coaches this year, was that we've kind of like carved our specific roles around which pieces of the material we present.
Sure.
And then like, especially for me coming from teaching all of the material, once I was like, I really don't have to be on right now. It's like a big relief. I'm like, hey, my dad died this summer.
day one.
Yeah, day one of, so I was like, there's moments where it's like, no, I really need to take advantage of the fact that I can fully trust you guys to deliver this material. But at the same time, like this year, it was like we started like online as things were playing out, subtly giving each other suggestions and feedback. And I try to be really like, officially I'm the leader of the group, right? And so I tried to be really clear about when I was suggesting a change that you could say no to.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Like, this is what I'm feeling called to, or I'm curious about this, but I don't know what you're trying to get to.
Yeah.
So if what I'm saying doesn't land, throw it out. Right? And I think it's a difficult thing. I think it's difficult from both parties to really like recognize, is that true? Like, is that going to be okay? How do I pull in that information? But I think having that level of trust and ability is part of what makes the event so special.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Like, because conflict is going to arise, and we all have a perspective on what we think is the best.
Right.
And we're all kind of tuning in to the emergent. And yeah, like sometimes they're like, Kyle, like that, I don't think that really landed. And I'm like, I want to like defend it. It's like my initial reaction is like, actually, let me tell you why it did go well. And then I'm like, okay, like actually, it's that could have been true. Can I hear the feedback so that I can hopefully like do better?
Right.
And I think that's like a really important community building practice.
One of my mentors, Yasuhiko Kimura, used to talk a lot about alignment beyond agreement. And he would talk about building good teams, right? He was a Zen guy who turned into like a corporate consultant. but one of his things was you need alignment beyond agreement. So you want people on teams that actually disagree about a lot of like how to get there, but are all aligned about where they want to go.
Yeah.
You know? So I think that's actually one of the things that we kind of are embodying. And it's one of the reasons like there's potent stuff happening in the retreats. Not a lot of disagreement, but it's like there's different styles and different ways to get there.
Processing.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to say it. It's like a healthy tension. I think opponent processing is, again,
It keeps things dynamic.
You need to be pushed to be pulled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the
Triponent process.
One of my mentors, my gymnastics coach, when I was teaching gymnastics for him, he said he wished he could just clone himself and have like 5 Gordys to coach, right?
Gordy.
Yeah. And I think that ultimately that's less generative, that a tribe that contains different personalities, that contains different perspectives, will end up with a broader perspective and a better ability. Like, essentially, we as a facilitation group, we're trying to have a clear goal and an attunement to the group and whether what we're doing in the moment is actually delivering on the goal.
Yeah.
And like, because we have different personalities, we will resonate with different information that's coming from the students. It's not just that we have 3 sets of eyes. It's that those eyes actually have different frames.
Yeah.
So we get a more multi-layered. It's like, you know, you get better information about a stick because you can hold it and see it.
Right.
And smell it.
Touch
right?
it, put it in your mouth.
Touch it, put it in your mouth.
Yeah.
In the same way, by having different perspectives, we actually are able to contain a larger slice of the reality that our students are experiencing.
And when we all agree on something, it's like, it's the obvious, right? Definitely, we're going to cut this whole day. Like, yep, okay.
I know. Sometimes the things that we like decide to do feel really radical, but like when you feel that all of the coaches are attuned,
it would definitely serve the group to not do a 2-hour bus ride.
Yeah.
Like stay on the proper. Like,
Yeah.
that's what they need.
I think that's the interesting point, is because of the alignment and maybe the, not disagreement, but the different perspectival approaches, is that we're not so agreeable, so that when we do agree, it is actually like, it's radical, but powerful and obvious.
It's actually a really powerful idea.
Yeah.
That not agreeing unless you really agree is a really important way of getting high integrity information.
Yeah. Big time. Big time. And I think that's like, we each have like enough strength of personality to be like, right? You don't have a bunch of clones. It's not like
That was a really
a bunch
important
of young
thing
acolytes are just like, you know, wanting to do what Rafe wants to do. Yeah.
Or even when I was like, I don't think this is a good idea, but we should try this. And everybody's like,
I was
that's
like,
a great idea.
absolutely.
I'm like,
And it worked, man. I think that worked, you know? Go team.
wait, no, low
Look how
five,
embodied we are. We
low
can't even
five.
touch each other's hands.
I think that's a good place to finish this.
Yeah.
Feel good? Boom. This has been a very interesting episode of the Evolvement Play podcast. If you don't know about Kyle and you don't know about Aaron, they've been huge contributors to what we're doing. We want you guys to understand these guys and what they're contributing in Evolvement Play much better. So hopefully you'll see their faces a lot coming up on a lot of different channels.
Yeah, we're at all the retreats.
Yeah.
And
Come play.
come play with me and Kyle.
Hashtag come play.